The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zig Zag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, across the moat from Oakland. And I am the guy who speaks to some of the most interesting folks on the planet. Also a big baseball fan, so I'm going to combine my skills today in producing interesting people who love baseball as I do. I'd like to welcome to the airwaves for the first time Mr. Maxwell Kates. How are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Good. I pronounced your name correctly, so I got half of it. Am I correct?
Well, like Rupert Pupkin from the King of Comedy, it is often misspelled and mispronounced, but you got it right.
Good. King of Comedy. I think that was Jerry Lewis. Was that?
That's absolutely it. Martin Scorsese film.
He played one of the most interesting parts. I did comedy for a long time in the 80s and 90s, and so I could identify a little bit. But he, given it was Jerry Lewis, and we didn't get to see his dramatic acting skills very often, I was thrilled with that, and I watch it when it comes up on reruns and this, that, and the other thing. Great reference.
Thank you.
I'm gonna try to get to know you a little bit because it's your first time. I want to know two things: what music did you listen to as a kid, and what books did you read to get you to this point in life? First, start with the music. What were you interested in?
The music. Well, my parents were big Beatles fans, so I was introduced to the Beatles at a very young age, and listened to a lot of the hits of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A lot of Motown music, a little bit of jazz, all different kinds of music.
Good. You're eclectic in that way.
That's it. I mean, I've seen the concerts I've seen range from rap when I was a little kid to things like the Temptations, and also things like the Daniel Birnbaum East-West Event Orchestra, which I saw in Salzburg, Austria about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay. That is eclectic. You go from one end of the spectrum to another. I'll ask you this: if you were forced to take only one album to a desert remote or something like that, if you were stranded on an island, could only play one album over and over again, what would that be?
That's an excellent question. Probably, well, one of the first concept albums that I ever heard was Abbey Road, and that has stayed with me all these years. So let's go with that one. Plus, it's got my name on it.
Hey, yeah, absolutely.
I happen to be a serial killer in the song, but no different from Maxwell Murder, which was put up by Rancid many years later, or even Mac the Knife, which was put up by Bobby Darin a decade before.
Yes, and I wonder, had Bobby Darin lived, what his career would have he sung some of the Sinatra stuff, the Great American Songbook. He was like 34 when he died, and it was much too young. He had a bad heart, if I'm not mistaken. Splish Splash, that was his first hit, and I remember that being when I was like 12, and pretty cool. You mentioned some good names. How about books? You're a baseball writer, so what baseball books did you read that influenced you when you were a kid?
Well, I read The Boys of Summer when I was quite young. I read some of the David Halberstam books, the October of '64, for example, a number of biographies, a number of social histories. Right now I'm reading a book that's actually appropriate to your part of the world. It's by Lincoln Mitchell. It's called San Francisco Year Zero. It's all about the city of San Francisco in 1978, and it fuses a tapestry of things like Harvey Milk and Jonestown and Jello Biafra and Terry Whitfield.
Terry Whitfield of the Giants.
That's correct.
An outfielder of mediocre ability in the field, but he was a pretty good hitter, and I liked him. So how does he fit into that book?
Well, he had he probably had his optimal year, at least in American baseball, in 1978. He had a few good years in Japan as well. But the Giants in 1978, they were a third-place team, which seems rather modest by global standards. But when you consider that the Giants were drawing in the thousands in 74 and 75 and nearly lost the team to Toronto in 76, to have done that well in 78 and to have picked up Vida Blue from the Oakland A's in spring training, and Willie McCovey was in the sunset of his career, that was quite an accomplishment.
And they got Willie McCovey back from San Diego, which was nice that he got to finish it in up north. Let's put it that way. He was one of those that didn't look good in any other uniform but the Giants.
Well, Willie McCovey and Orlando Cepeda were probably the first two stars with the Giants to play exclusively for the team in San Francisco. Willie Mays had played for the Giants in New York and was seen as a New York player by the local fans, first at Seal Stadium and then at Candlestick Park. So McCovey was one of the first that San Francisco considered their own. So for him to come back to San Francisco at the end of his career was sort of a fitting touch, the same way for Willie Mays to have gone back to New York for the last couple of years to play for the Mets.
Yeah, I have very mixed memories about that. I'm a Met fan, was a Giant fan growing up, came out here in '66 with the Air Force, so I got to see the Giants most of my adult life, but only followed the Mets long distance. So seeing Willie as a little kid with the New York Giants, seeing him in his second incarnation as a superstar in San Francisco, and then watching him at the end of his career, a lot of mixed emotions. He did help them win in that year. He came back to San Francisco, traded for Charlie Williams, as a matter of fact. He did come back, and they won in '73. He famous for falling down in the outfield a little bit at the end, and he was still Willie. He couldn't do it every day, but there were days he was terrific and remained the best athlete on that team, even though he was close to 40 or over 40. And yes, the Giants were in transition. I think Jimmy Davenport had managed them to a last place finish, and Al Rosen took over shortly thereafter and brought in Hum Baby.
Roger Craig.
Roger the Dodger, Roger Craig. And so the Giants, even when they weren't winning before those 3 World Series in 5-6 years, they were on an upswing, and they were very, very interesting as they went. You mentioned Vida Blue, an enigma in terms of your typical story of a guy who comes up as a superstar. Charlie Finley kind of broke his spirit. There was some drugs involved. And like you mentioned, when he came over, it was the blockbuster trade. It was like 15 players involved. I may be exaggerating a little bit, but it was a big thing, him crossing the bay. And helping the Giants become decent. Those are good years.
Well, you mentioned Al Rosen and you mentioned Roger Craig, and those were the Giants that were playing at the time that I was growing up. You had two rookies on the right side of the infield. You had Will Clark at first base, and then Robbie Thompson at second. Matt Williams joined them a few years later. 85 was when they joined the Giants. I think they went something like 62 and 100. 2 years later, they had won their division, and 2 years after that, of course, they were in the World Series. That was 1989.
I'm going to tell you a quick story about, you mentioned Robbie Thompson. In the 80s and 90s, I worked as the Topps baseball card representative on the West Coast. And it was my job to go to each summer to travel around the Northwest League and the California League and sign players, obligating them to contracts with Topps that would guarantee that if and when they made the major leagues, we Topps would use their picture on baseball cards. And in the meantime, we'd give them a small signing bonus of $5. Everybody got the same $5 check. And like I say, I'd go to the minors and do this, talk to players, and tell them exactly what I just said, what we're doing contractually, and pretty much use the same words. Well, it's Fresno, California in must have been 1976 when Robbie was a rookie, and I approached him at his locker, and I said, Robbie, I'm Ralph Tycho with Topps. I have a contract for you to sign. It obligates you to this, that, and the other thing. You make the big leagues. If and when you make it. And he looks at me. Remember, this is a guy 5'9", 5'10", 150 pounds, wire thin. Looks like a guy who's just going to be minor league fodder, but who knows? And he showed me that wasn't the case by the way he responded. He said to me, if and when is the factor. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be, no question about that. And he looked at me with disgust. So I liked him right there with that self-confidence. And I got to explain to him he was a Giant rookie, and his name was Thompson, and I explained about Bobby Thompson, who had no P in his name, and Hank Thompson, who was a Giant in 51 when I first started being a baseball fan as a little kid. My grandfather would take me to the Polo Grounds, and those guys were playing, and I explained to him the history. You're Thompson with a P. Bobby Thompson had no P, this, that. And we got along beautifully. The conversation switched, and we got along beautifully. But my point is, I will never forget the intensity and the look in his face. And it's my belief that if you think you're going to make it, you may make it. If you don't know, probably you won't. And it's all confidence, and pretty much every player that signed, with few exceptions, have excellent ability, the physical ability. They all are world-class athletes, potentially. And what makes a world-class athlete, in addition to one's body, is one's head. And Bobby Thompson will go down as my favorite all-time baseball player because I got to watch him day in and day out in those years when he was up. And he was nothing but a gritty hustler. And he had a terrific career. So, excuse my interruption.
No, that's quite all right. I mean, Bobby Thompson, everybody knows, of course, about the shot heard around the world in Game 3 of that playoff series between the Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers, which he hit off Ralph Branca in relief. What not a lot of people realize, Game 1 of that same series, he won the game also with a home run off Ralph Branca.
And Branca threw him a fastball.
He did.
And he comes right back and throws him a fastball. Come to find out, he knew, did Bobby Thompson, what pitch was coming. There was an elaborate sign-stealing setup led by Leo DeRocher and Herman Franks. They had a telescope in the center field bleachers. But like Sal Magley told Ralph Branca, you should have thrown a curveball, meat. And that was it. He knew it was coming. Still got to hit the ball, but great baseball knowledge for a young guy like yourself. What was your first game that you
My
watched?
first game was August 3rd, 1988, the Toronto Blue Jays and the Minnesota Twins. The Twins were the defending world champions, and the Blue Jays had not moved into what was then called Skydome. They were still playing at Exhibition Stadium. I remember the matchup was Jeff Musselman, who was a Harvard graduate, pitching for the Blue Jays, and a former San Francisco Giant was towing the line for the Twins, Juan Berenguer. And Twins won the game by a score of 8-3. There was only one home run hit by the Blue Jays, oddly enough, by Fred McGriff. And the hero of the game, a name you don't hear very often, Steve Lombardozzi. I think he went 5 for 5 with 2 singles and a double or something like that.
That is a name that does not come readily to mind. And now, did you go back later? They have baseball retroactive. You could go, or something like that. You can go find any game, the box score, the rundown, any game in history. Do you have memories of that, or did you refresh your memory looking back?
That particular game was all from memory. I'm aware of the website that you talk about. It's called Retro Sheet, and David Smith out of Delaware is a pioneer of it. And I love that site. I go there all the time when I'm doing my research. If I'm not sure about something that might have happened in a game, I'll go there. And as you say, no matter what game, no matter what play, no matter what inning, you'll find it.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. I talk often to folks the advantages and disadvantages of the computer age that we live in. I think it limits social ability for one-on-one contact, human contact, but it certainly has other advantages in terms of renewing friendships that people would not have been able to get in touch with each other years ago, were it not for Facebook groups, this, that, and the other thing. But one of the things that it definitely does, it solves all the things we're curious about. You just push a button, Google this, Google that, and the questions are answered. It's a marvelous age we live in.
You had mentioned before you were talking about being a photographer for Topps and signing players to contracts. Reminiscent of a story.
It was the photographers for Topps were separate than the folks that did the contracts, but close enough, yes.
But the story I was going to tell, just with Marvin Miller's recent induction into the Hall of Fame, is that was actually the subject of one of his first protests. He was upset that the players were being paid, I don't even think it was $5 at that point to have their pictures used, and so for the 1967 and 1968 season, he instructed the members of the union, don't pose for any photographs. And that's where you'll see, if in the 68 and the first 4 series of the 69 baseball cards, most of the pictures were repeats from previous sets. If you look at Willie Mays' picture in the 1969 Topps set, for example, that's the same picture they used in the 1966 Topps set. Only in the last 2 series of the 1969 set, which were taken in spring training, did Marvin Miller and the Players Union finally relent.
Whoa, I didn't know that. I did remember in those years, again, I was traveling up to the Northwest League, and one of the managers up there was a fellow by the name of Rob Piccolo, who was managing the A's, and he, when I went to visit that team and speak to that team, had to make a call to his union to see if they were giving permission to even sign contracts. And Rob recently passed away, rest his soul. But he, so you're absolutely right on. And Marvin Miller changed the face of baseball. Absolutely changed the face of baseball. I'm pleasantly surprised that he made it into the Hall of Fame. Never thought I'd live to see that day. It's a totally political organization, and he took it to the owners. Did Marvin Miller, and really every baseball player today should. You make $500,000 a year as a first-year salary coming in into the big leagues. You got to thank your lucky stars, because when I was growing up, the minimum salary was like $6,000. It's gone to $500,000. Talk about inflation. That has nothing to do with it compared to free agency and what he was enabled to accomplish, Mr. Miller.
Well, I was very pleased to see when Garrett Cole signed that monster contract with the Yankees. I think it was 9 years, $324 million. He thanked Marvin Miller and he thanked Curt Flood for their pioneering to get him and the other members of the Players Union to this point, because not a lot of credit has been given to either of them by contemporary players.
I'm surprised that any contemporary player, Marvin Miller, I'm sure, he didn't die that long ago, and it's pretty fresh in people's mind if you're negotiating contracts. But Curt Flood and what he went through to get it to that point, the sadness of how his life turned out as a result of him just wanting no more than to choose where his family lived. It comes down to that. And Marvin Miller did it by threatening basically the antitrust system that baseball has thrived on. And that brought them to their knees. He could have gone to court and changed baseball from in a different way if the antitrust thing had gone down, had fallen. Now, there's another thing with minor league baseball being threatened by the powers that be in Major League Baseball. There's a threat again to the antitrust agreement that baseball, I think baseball is the only industry that still has that. Am I correct?
I think so. I mean, I can remember reading, there's a book called Lords of the Realm by Don Helyar, and one of the owners, I think it was O'Malley, was quoted as saying, "We're the only legal monopoly in America, and we're bleeping it up." He actually used a different verb, but we are on the air.
Yes. No, it's a podcast, but bleeping is strong enough language. I think we know. We can say fuck, but we don't have to. It's one of the rules. Not necessary. It's not a prerequisite. Some podcasters think it is, think that because FCC doesn't control it and what have you. But and it's a strong word. It's a great word, but you could overuse it. So I'm glad you chose bleep. and that will look better in your byline. Tell me what you're working on, your next project.
Well, I actually just finished a project. I was working with Bill Brown of the Houston Astros. Bill was the radio voice of the Astros for 30 years, and he was with the Cincinnati Reds before that. Bill has recently written a book called The Astros Golden Years, and it's all about the focus is on the past season for the Astros, but he also has stories from throughout his baseball career, including working with people like Wade Hoyt at the Cincinnati Reds and he talked about calling opening day for the Astros his first year, which was 1987, and then some of the World Series memories, and of course the contemporary team. So that's actually available now. You can buy it on Amazon.
And how did you two collaborate, and what was your agreement in collaboration?
Well, I've been involved for the past 5 years or so. I've been involved with the Houston Sabre chapter quite a bit. I went to Houston to speak at the convention in 2014, and I spoke on a topic called "The Bikers Beat the Boy Scouts: Facial Hair in the 1972 World Series." Of course, the Oakland A's, that was the year of Mustache Day, and they all had facial hair and they green and gold uniforms and white shoes, and the Cincinnati Reds looked like they were working for U.S. Steel. There was no facial hair, short hair, stirrup socks, and it was how the attitudes changed emanating from that World Series. Anyways, I got invited to go back to Houston to speak a couple times since, and it was through my association with the Sabre chapter there that I got to know a lot of great people. I got to know Tal Smith, who had been the general manager there, and Greg Lucas, who had been a broadcaster, and some former players like Larry Durker and the Toy Cannon, Jimmy Wynn, and also Bill Brown. And before I was an accountant, I wanted to be a broadcaster. And in my career, I got as far as St. Catharines, Ontario. I did a weekly radio show there, and then I realized it was time to find another career. And so to be able to work vicariously through people like Bill Brown, that's something I feel very good about. And Bill said, I'm doing this book. If you'd like to read the manuscripts and offer suggestions, you're welcome to it. So that was how that project came about.
Were I you, I would not give up on broadcasting. Even to this day, you have the pipes, my friend.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and the knowledge behind it. I wouldn't give up on that dream.
Thank you.
We have a lot in common. When I was a kid, I was 15 and floundering in school and no interest in anything but baseball. And I went to my very, very well-intending father, who grew up in a time where there was no fallback, there was no welfare system. He escaped the country, the Nazis, to get to this country. And he asked me, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to be the broadcaster for the New York Yankees." And his response was, "That's crazy. Do you know how many people want to be the broadcaster for the New York Yankees? You better get into something stable and get rid of those nonsense dreams and this, that, and the other thing." Again, I'm prefacing this. May he rest in peace. He was well-meaning, but he could not have said anything more damaging to me than that. One doesn't kill a kid's dream. Whatever the kid's dream is, do not kill it. Do not put your limitations on the child. His answer to me should have been, "Let's find the best broadcasting school." Blah, blah, blah. Again, he was a product of his times. I understand looking back. And it wasn't his fault that it took me years and years to get into radio through podcasting and this, that, and the other thing. So my point is, killing a dream for the sake of killing a dream isn't a great idea. That's my point. And I encourage you to pursue anything that you ever dreamt about for in terms of broadcasting? Because, like I say, I'm not just throwing smoke. I listen to a lot of folks, and you are a natural on the air.
Well, thank you very much. It's
all right.
You talk about dreams, you talk about broadcasting, and one of the highlights, I just finished co-editing a book with Bill Nowlin a year ago. It's called Time for Expansion Baseball. And the reason I picked that title, see, the project went without a title for months, and then I picked that one as a tribute to Vin Scully. He, of course, his famous line was, "It's time for Dodger baseball." And I mean, growing up, we had subscriptions to a number of what they called super stations. We had the Braves on TBS, we had the Cubs and the White Sox on WGN, the Red Sox on WSBK for a while, we had the two New York teams, and we had the Dodgers.
WOR, I think WOR carried the Mets on cable when in the years you were growing up.
That's right. It wasn't the Mets. We had WPIX for the Yankees. We didn't have WWOR, but we had we did have Dodger games, and if they were playing on the East Coast, the games would have started early enough that we could have listened to them. And for me, it wasn't so much watching the Dodgers; it was watching Vin Scully. I mean, I would watch his broadcast religiously and study what he had to say, because he could appeal to such a wide audience, not just for baseball, but he'd bring in history, he'd bring in literature, he'd tell a narrative, not so much as broadcast the game. And I'm watching this, I'm thinking, that's what I want to do. And one of the highlights involving with that project was I actually sent a copy to Vin Scully. I got in touch with somebody in the Dodgers Public Relations Department. I want to respect Mr. Scully's privacy, but at the same time, I also want him to know what an influence he's been on me. And he told me where to send it, how to go about doing it. And then 2 months later, there was a letter in the mail from the Los Angeles Dodgers, and inside there was a little note from Mr. Scully telling me how much he appreciated me sending him the book and timing it with his birthday, which is November 29th. And at the very bottom, he printed his first name, Vin. So that's quite an important accomplishment for me, I think, to have connected with someone I really looked up to. Hello?
I'm saying absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Your accomplishment, what did you say after that, start to say after that?
I thought we were off the air, but apparently we're back on.
No, we're on. I'm listening to you.
Oh, that's great.
Okay.
So,
what was your accomplishment with? Elaborate on your accomplishment in getting that letter from Vin Scully. Elaborate on your feelings and how that.
Well, it just felt like I'd come full circle. That here I was watching somebody famous, somebody I never thought I'd meet or connect with, and I remember one time going to a spring training game, and between innings. The Dodgers were playing, I think they were playing the Expos, and between innings I went up to the Dodgers broadcast booth. I had a yearbook with me, and I passed it along. I said, could you please give it to all the broadcasters to sign it? And came back with Ross Porter, came back with Rick Monday, and I think it came back with Jaime Jarin, who was a Spanish-language broadcaster. So I asked, it was Ross Porter, I asked him, did Vin not make the trip? And he said Vin didn't want to do it. I said, well, he's Vin. He can do what he wants. And knowing how he respects how he prioritizes his privacy, and knowing what a talented broadcaster he was, and he's respected in all fields, to have made that connection with him, I just felt like this is the next best thing to living out, to have had the opportunity to have lived out being a broadcaster. I was told at one stage that being Canadian would have been a liability in being a baseball broadcaster, because the stereotype among Canadians is that we don't have the knowledge. I mean, the stereotype among Canadians is that we, as Harold Reynolds broadcast in the playoffs, was that we can't catch a foul ball, and in my case, that's probably true. But apart from Dan Shulman and apart from Stu Nahan, who was a Montrealer who called pregame and postgame for the Dodgers in the 70s, I can't think of too many Canadians who have done play-by-play or color commentary for any American teams. That's just being realistic.
Claude Ramon, if I remember, was a broadcaster, but I think he was with Toronto.
The Expos, actually. He was.
Montreal. Okay.
Yeah, he was a broadcaster for the Expos for about 30 years, and then the last couple of years of the team, he coached with them. He was, I think, he may have been one of the only people associated with the Expos to have worked for the team in all 36 years of its existence. Even when he was still pitching for the Atlanta Braves in the early part of the 1969 season, he was working in the ticket office for the Expos during that off season before the Expos picked him up.
Very interesting. Is he still with us?
Absolutely, he is.
There would be a guy with a book in his head.
Yeah, there actually is a Claude Ramon book. He wrote a biography in the early 70s. It was only published in French. But there is one out there that exists on him.
Yes, he saw some incredibly interesting Montreal Expo teams. Comes to mind the guy that they couldn't keep became a free agent.
Mark Langston.
Yes, Mark Langston. Wonder how their fate would have changed had they kept him.
Well, that was the year they traded 3 young pitchers to Seattle for Langston. Langston was an impending free agent. The biggest prize of the deal that the Expos had relinquished was actually Brian Holman and not Randy Johnson. Randy Johnson was at that time seen as a novelty act. Here was a 6'10" left-hander who didn't have a stellar reputation on the field, but once he got to Seattle, I mean, he pitched a no-hitter, I think, the following year, and then he won the Cy Young in '95. Then he went to Arizona and really became a superstar. But not a lot was expected of Randy Johnson from the Expos. Meanwhile, once the Expos had traded for Mark Langston, it was an open secret that he wasn't going to re-sign with the Expos. Their record was 23-23 when they picked him up, and although they did contend, they were in first place for a good 6 weeks of the season, they came crashing down to earth the last 2 months of the season, and Langston's attitude, by my recollection, had a lot to do with that, and they ended the season with the exact same record as they were when they traded for Langston, 81-81, and he said he wanted to pitch for a California team. He was a San Diego guy, and he ended up signing with the Angels. That same year, they also lost Pascual Perez, and they also lost Bryn Smith, 60% of the starting rotation.
What part of Canada are you from?
I was born and raised in Ottawa, and I now live in Toronto.
Okay. So, in a sense, you followed Montreal long distance.
Well, growing up, I probably followed the Expos more than the Blue Jays, not only because of the proximity from Ottawa to Montreal, but also we used to go to spring training. My uncle had a place in Plantation, Florida, which is 20 minutes west of Fort Lauderdale, and we had another aunt and uncle who lived in the winter months in West Palm Beach. So the 3 teams we'd see spring training games of were the Yankees, the Expos, and the Atlanta Braves. So I probably knew those 3 teams a lot better than I knew the Blue Jays until I moved to Toronto. We used to have the Expos winter caravan come to Ottawa. I remember one year they came to the Rideau Canal and went skating on the Rideau Canal. And Tom Foley, who's from Georgia, didn't know what he was. What am I doing on skates? I'm a Georgia boy. And Brian Holman was there as well. He was from Colorado. He was a natural on skates. And Rex Hudler was from Arizona, and he was about in the same category as Foley. But those are the memories you have from growing up.
Oh, I can imagine. Tim Foley was a Met later on. He was a super ball player.
This wasn't Tim Foley. This was Tom Foley.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Tim Foley was a different guy, but I remember him too.
A shortstop.
That's right. Yeah, he was actually the first Expos player to hit for the cycle.
Tim Foley was?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, very interesting. Amazing. Is baseball not a great sport in terms of memories and putting yourself as a kid in the seat in the stands, and your memories? you don't just remember the game, but you remember you being a kid.
Oh, sure. I mean,
go ahead.
I think you can say that to some extent with every sport, but certainly I have a lot of memories of that with baseball. I mean, just recently on Facebook, someone was talking about a game late in the 1993 season when the Expos and the Phillies went into extra innings. It was right near the end of the season, and the two teams were fighting for a playoff spot. Curtis Pride, who was born 95% deaf, was making his major league debut that night, and he hit a double to tie up the game at 7 apiece. And just the roar from the stands, may seem hard to believe now, but close to 46,000 people at Olympic Stadium. And
wow.
Even though Pride couldn't hear it, he could feel the rumble from the seats. And the Expos ended up winning that game, I think, in the bottom of the 12th. And I remember the whole thing. I remember someone commented on the attendance, 46,000 give or take, and I said, well, if it wasn't for me, it would have been 45,999.
That's absolutely right. Proving we all have a voice. We're all important.
That's it.
It is. You're terrific. I want to close out, but I want to call attention to something you said that is really ironic. You were talking about 72 when the Reds played the A's, and it was like two generations, facial hair and this. When the Yankees signed Garrett Cole, they made him shave his facial hair. We are 50 years down the road, almost, from that, and still there's that craziness about appearance. Would you address that?
Well, I think the Yankees are the only team that still has that. I mean, they do allow mustaches, but I don't think they allow long hair, and they certainly don't allow beards. I don't understand it.
I don't even think they allow mustaches. I think that's they made Mattingly shave. I don't know, but it appears silly to me. That's all. I mean, where every person shouldn't be allowed to assume the identity that they want, to stand out in their own way, look the way they want. Why is that done? Is that done? Is discipline done just for the sake of discipline? Or, that's rhetorical. I mean, but it amazes me that 50 years after the 72 World Series, almost 50 years, that we're going through the same thing. He was bummed out, but he'll take the $1 zillion that they gave him every day of the week.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where their logic is. I know when George Steinbrenner was alive, he just didn't like the sight of long hair and beards. In fact, he was suspended in 1975 and came back to the team in 1976 and was looking at their yearbook on opening night and saw all the pictures from the year before when the players had long hair, and he ordered them to recall the yearbook because he didn't want to see any photographic record of Yankees players with long hair. So the 76 Yankee yearbook wasn't really issued until June again, and so it's one of the more difficult ones to find.
Very interesting. Interesting
you had some
that he was offended by long hair, but he wasn't offended by him being a convicted felon.
Well, I guess it's all a matter of priorities.
Right. Anyway, hey, Maxwell, you're terrific. I hope you'll come back on often and regularly and just talk a little ball with me. How about that?
I'd love that. I'm looking forward to the next show, and sounds like a plan.
Beautiful. I will keep in touch and send you a link to this when it's posted earlier in the week. in the upcoming week. And I want to thank you for joining Comfortably Zoned Radio.
And thank you for having me on Comfortably Zoned Radio.
All right, my friend. Thank you. It's Maxwell Kates. He is terrific, and I lived up to my agreement with my audience. Only the most interesting, fascinating people with a passion will come on this show. And thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I'm Ralph Tycho. It's the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We'll be back soon. Adios. The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.